Hello BookTube, it's Roz back for a scallydandling video. Now you know those are when I talk about a book that's from somewhere that's sort of beyond my everyday experience. And today it's I the Supreme by Augusto Roa Bastos, and was a Paraguayan writer, and this is the first book that I've read from Paraguay, and I'm glad I did. But I read this book as a buddy read with Hester, brilliant BookTube commenter, and I'm very, very glad that I read it with someone else, and someone as cheerful and thoughtful as Hester, because I needed that to get me through this book sometimes. That company. Even though I'm now very, very glad that I have read it. Let me explain. Oh, but first thing we always do in our scallydandles is think, have we got a good clear idea in our mind of where this place is? Where is Paraguay? South America, obviously. Now, I don't have my globe because I'm on holiday in Wales, so I'm gonna get you to kind of imagine the sort of elongated upside down pear shape of South America, and Paraguay is at the point where it's really starting to narrow towards the stalk of the pear, and it's a landlocked country, and it's got sort of to the northwest Bolivia, to the northeast and around quite a bit of it downside Brazil, and then kind of below it in the south is Argentina. It's not next door to Uruguay, which is something that people often assume, I think. So it's landlocked. It has access to the Atlantic via the Paraguay River, but of course that can be blockaded by the countries that are either side of it because Paraguay is landlocked, which is relevant to the story. It's quite physically a fairly big country, although not big in South American terms, compared with Brazil, big countries. But population only about 7 million people, so yeah, not huge. That thing of being kind of landlocked and in some ways isolated, the kind of intensity and claustrophobia of the book feels very much in keeping with that. Yeah, it's a book that where the history and geography and I don't know, almost sociology of the country is really integral to the novel. I think Hester and I, both found that we spent quite a bit of time having to shut the book and go away and look things up in order to make sense of it, to understand about Paraguayan independence and Paraguayan history and so on. And because this is essentially a work of historical fiction, but it's not your average historical fiction novel, put it that way. But it is, about the Supreme of the title is a real person, El Supremo, who was the first dictator of Paraguay. He took control not long after Paraguay had broken with Spanish control, and I should give you his proper name, Jose Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, or Francia, oh, yeah, and he was dictator from 1814 to 1840, and this is not typical historical fiction, but nor was El Supremo a typical dictator. In fact, he was fascinated by Voltaire and Rousseau and so on, and that very much comes into the book. He, in running Paraguay, he was attempting to establish a kind of utopian state along the lines that Rousseau would have suggested. he was quite isolationist. You have to see in this context that at that time, like all of South America was breaking away from Spanish and Portuguese control. Well, there was little bits of British and Dutch stuff up at the top, but basically Spanish and Portuguese. And as you have the Napoleonic Wars and things changing in Spain and Portugal, that gave the opportunity for countries in South America to break away. Well, they weren't yet countries, were they? So Paraguay gets independence, but you've got to imagine that there's Brazil and Argentina that are not yet Brazil and Argentina. They're kind of like forming states and federations, and both of them potentially would have liked to absorb Paraguay. It wasn't yet obvious that Paraguay was going to sustain itself as a separate nation. And El Supremo was key in making that happen. And one of the things he does to sort of reduce Spanish influence, I suppose, is he restricts the power of the Catholic Church and ultimately nationalise it. He makes it a Paraguayan church, not to bring it more under his control. He one of his most interesting laws that he introduced was to say that colonial residents, citizens, like those of Spanish and Portuguese origin, were not allowed to marry each other. They had to marry, indigenous people from Paraguay, like Amerindians. That's an outdated term, but you know what I mean, or blacks or mixed race people. They couldn't marry each other, to try and create a sort of a mestizo Paraguayan nation that was not so tied to a Spanish or Portuguese kind of loyalty or culture. His success actually in doing that is shown by the fact that Paraguay remained independent. It's now an almost entirely mestizo nation, apart from more recent immigrants, and Paraguayans are bilingual, almost universally bilingual in speaking both Spanish and Guarani, which was the main indigenous language of the area. So he achieved his aim, I guess. In the sort of utopian Rousseau sort of like way, he tried to promote the peasants, the economy, local agriculture. He set up state-run hospitals, the first public library in Paraguay. That's going to appeal to us booktubers, isn't it? So all of those things at the same time. He was not a dictator that sought to line his own pockets by any means, but he could be ruthless and cruel and brutal. He had underground prisons and prison camps in far corners of the country. He outlawed all opposition. So a huge character in Paraguay's history, and in choosing to write about him, Bastos is taking on all of that history. So you can see why it was a fascinating topic to grasp. It was really writing about the fundamentals of Paraguayan independence and nation building, I suppose. Something about Bastos. So he was born in 1917. He only died in 2005. As I say, he wrote this in the 1970s. He was a writer of all sorts. He was a journalist, a screenwriter, a poet. He wrote short stories. He was an academic writer, but he's probably best known now as for the 3 novels that he wrote, of which this one is probably considered, his masterpiece, his greatest achievement. He, like most Paraguayans, I said, was bilingual in Guarani and Spanish. He wrote in Spanish because that was like the literary language of Paraguay then, in terms of how he was educated. But he uses lots of Guarani vocabulary in this as well. So he was sort of establishing a literary language for Paraguay that brought the two languages together. That was one of the sort of interesting aspects of reading the book, I suppose. It's also relevant to know that he wrote this book whilst he was in exile from Paraguay because of the oppressive dictatorship that was then current in Paraguay. And then he was in exile in Argentina and then had to leave Argentina because of the dictatorship that took control there whilst he was exiled there, and he then moved to France. So it's not fortuitous that he chose to write about a dictator. This is definitely a book about dictatorship. That is that thing of using historical fiction to write about contemporary politics. But it's not only that. It's not like a kind of lightly veiled sort of contemporary satire or whatever. This is a much richer, deeper book about, well, what's it about? It's about so much. I mean, I think before I say more about what it's about, I think it's probably worth saying that this is like Paraguay's equivalent of, I don't know, Ulysses or something. It's when we think about South American literature in the Anglophone world, well, I suppose like something like 100 Years of Solitude. 100 Years of Solitude is the sort of perhaps the one that first springs to mind as the most influential. Within South American sort of literature, this one is very much on a par with that, and in some ways, in some ways it's more interesting. But yeah, a very influential book. Possibly one of South America's greatest 20th century novels, so that kind of status, and not normal historical fiction by any means. It's sort of like fictionalized autobiography. A lot of it is written in the voice of El Supremo, as if he were writing. It's what he's dictating to his secretary, or he's writing for himself. But that is put together with other sources, real sources, fictional sources, as if it's been collated from lots of different sources and elements. Sometimes, there's like kind of extensive footnotes but they're part of the story. Intertextual, I think, is a word one might use. I don't know. So that allows him to use lots of different styles, lots of different, I don't know, genres in effect. So there's sort of confessional writing, there's, say, autobiography, there's biography, as in other people writing about El Supremo. There's bits that read like philosophical treatises. There's bits that are more like kind of sociology. There's bits that are like reading chunks of history. Then there's bits that are kind of like myth, or yes, almost sort of more personal. It leaps around through different styles, whilst carrying a lot of quite factual content, or in terms of Paraguay's history. So I suppose quite an experimental structure, basically. And I think that it works, but it creates challenges for you as a reader. I suppose deliberately he wants you to sort of not quite know where you are with it all the time, and you really have to stay on your toes as you read it. There's a sense in which, well, is it a magical realist book? I've heard it described as magical realist. It's like it seems to be compulsory to describe South American 20th century novels as magical realist. I'm not sure that's the best way to describe it. I mean, he draws very much on Guarani myth and language and culture and ideas. It's almost like a ghost story, in the sense that it, as far as I could work out, it begins at the point when the real El Supremo dies, and it's almost as if he's too big and huge and I don't know, his brain carries on living beyond him. You know, he can't just die when he literally dies, and the whole book with all, which then goes back and forth in his mind and over his life and over Paraguay's history, and then almost seems to foretell part of the future as well. All of that is in the time between him literally dying and finally sort of accepting that, or running out of steam, and his presence finally leaving the building, as it were. So if you think that sounds magical realist, yeah, but that, I feel that's too simplistic a description of this as a book. So many ideas in this. One of the questions I guess this book asks is about writing. You know, what is writing? What it's almost like, what are the limits of language in expressing experience or expressing ideas? It's also very much about what is history, who gets to write history, and how do our individual and collective memories, what's their place in history? You know, does literal history matter if you're Paraguay, or is it, you know, your idea of Paraguay's history that matters most? And how does myth kind of interlink with that, I suppose? If I were a more literary type, I might be talking about metafiction here. I don't know. You know, you clever people out there, tell me if I've understood that. If this all sounds a bit heavy going, it sometimes is, but it can also be very warm, very humane. There's some really funny bits in the book. So, you know, it's not all big ideas and thumping through. There's the language sometimes is really sparkling. I've sometimes really delighted in the cleverness of it. Sometimes it was very poetic. There were amazing descriptions. You know, at times it really kind of brought to life a past Paraguay. But at the same time, a lot of the time you're in the head of this strange, obsessive, slightly demonic, but also very passionate and, in his own way, moral character, El Supremo, which Bastos writes about very ambivalently. You know, he both admires him and is horrified by him throughout, I think. And so are we. You know, there's this sort of horrible fascination about being in the head of El Supremo. Would I recommend it? Yes, I would. Sometimes it's a little too convoluted in its cleverness, but the rewards outweigh the irritations of that, I think. You know, it's a book for you if you are brave and adventurous and are really interested in the limits of writing and interested in learning more about Paraguay as well. Hester, my buddy read partner, summed it up perfectly, in fact, because she said to me that she had moments when she was reading this book when she absolutely loved it, and moments when she literally wanted to take her copy and throw it across the room. And that's kind of just about the perfect summary. So if you think you can handle that, then do read Either Supreme.